So very nice to be here, giving a longer talk. So in the spirit of dynamic walking, this is going to be a relatively free-form thing. And this talk in particular went through a couple of different titles, because when they send me the email saying, hey, you got a 20-minute slot, they say, oh, but you don't have to actually stick to your abstract. You can kind of talk about whatever you want. So this is the title of the abstract, Retinal Optic Flow and the Visual Control of Foot Placement, which I'll talk about. But you know, I wanted to sort of broaden it up a bit, so I thought maybe visual control of foot placement in natural terrain, which seemed nice, but then I sort of want to focus, I got some eye tracking stuff in there, so we're going to gaze into visual control of foot placement in natural terrain, but that seems a bit wordy, so maybe let's sort of tone it down to locomotion in natural terrain. But then that sort of seems a bit terse, so let's see to natural behavior in natural terrain. So that's sort of a little more general, focusing more on my advisor, Mary Hayhoe's idea of let's look at people in their environment, sort of see what happens from that. But from there I kind of thought, well, that's a little too natural maybe, so let's sort of focus on real world, right? So there's actual rocks of people walking around and stuff like that. But none of those quite seemed right, so I sort of sat back, sort of looked inside and sort of asked myself, what is it about this research that really gets me excited? What's the important thing about what I think I'm doing? So here's the actual official title of this talk that I'm about to give. It's Meet Robots and Laser Skeletons, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Measurement Error. So let's go on from there. Thank you. Pause for applause. So humans are magical meat robots. I think we can all agree on that. I don't think I need a citation for that. We have this really spectacular ability to sort of electrify our meaty parts in very precise ways to perform pretty much whatever we want to do. And you can pretty much guarantee that for any given activity that exists, there is some person in this world that has devoted their life to becoming arbitrarily good at that thing. So humans are magical meat robots that can do pretty much whatever they want. The problem is that we don't know how they work, and we're not allowed to take them apart. Robots, on the other hand, are non-magical regular robots. And although they can do some interesting things, they're not quite as broad as what humans can do. I know that there's more impressive robots out there, but I just do love this video, and I will never stop showing it. And I agree with Andy. So this is, by the way, baby Steve Collins. He has grown up so well. He has started wearing pants, but they do have rips in them. So perhaps we can sort of merge these sort of two things. So on the one hand, we have humans that can do anything, but we don't know how they work. On the other hand, we have robots that can't really do all that much, but we presumably know how they work. So perhaps we can sort of combine these two things to perhaps start to understand some aspects of how humans perform crazy things like this. So this is about 180 some odd pounds of salty meat tumbling continuously towards its goal. At roughly 2 times per second, he places a foot at some heretofore unencountered area of rocky terrain and manages every time to put, well, almost every time, to put his foot in a location that will not only support his weight, but also successfully redirect his mass in the direction that he wants to go. And he can do that sort of in this sort of recursive way, so each step leads to a new step. And the question is, how does this crazy thing actually happen? So for humans in particular, we do this on the basis of this magic thing called vision. So this is an eye. Light comes in here, gets focused by the lens, and sort of then gets absorbed by our retina. Retinas are very complicated, and they're also backwards, right? So this is sort of some evolutionary thing for when we came out of the ocean, our eyes kind of inverted. So now the light actually travels through these sort of ganglion cells and these middle layers, and only then reaches the photoreceptors, the rods and cones on the back of the retina. And the thing that I want to focus on most specifically about the eye is this little pit right here called the fovea. So the fovea is a place that's a feature of the primate eyes. Not all animals have ones, but we do. And that is an area, fovea is Latin for pit. And it's a place where all of those, I'm not wired, all those little sort of other stuff is sort of pushed aside so that you have a more unobstructed view, so that the photoreceptors have a more unobstructed view of the world. The fovea is about 1 square millimeter on the back of your retina. Roughly 50% of your visual cortex is devoted to processing information from that area. When you think about your visual acuity, you are thinking about your acuity at the fovea. And as you move, let's say about 10 degrees off your fovea, it's about this far. If you have 20/20 vision, by the time you get about 10 degrees off, you're about 20/75. You can't drive a car. And so our visual system is highly foveated, which means that our actual acuity is relegated to an area roughly the size of your thumbnail at arm's length. So if you have a visual system like this, it means that successful behavior requires you to be able to move that really high acuity fovea at a very, very precisely and very rapidly, which of course we do. So this is a giant floating eyeball that shows what someone's eyes look like when they walk over that rocky terrain I showed before. And as you can see, visual vision in this kind of environment is very active. And you could be forgiven when looking at this creepy eyeball for thinking that it maybe is somewhat stochastic, but it's not. As you walk over this environment, this is now video from an eye tracker where the crosshairs shows where the person's eye is looking and on each frame. As you can see, the eyes are sort of pointed in with very rapid precision, these sort of nice jerky saccadic movements to precise areas in the terrain that support this locomotor behavior. And so the nice thing about this, our foveated visual system is it means that you can basically just point a camera at someone's face, or 2 cameras at someone's face, and get this sort of physical measurement of the cognitive processes that underlie this type of behavior, right? Because we don't really control our eye movements to this consciously, but the direction your eye points is a really nice window into the information that your central nervous system thought that it needed to complete this task in a very sort of tight time loop. So to try to understand the relationship between this sort of visual thing that's happening and this sort of motor thing that's happening, I worked to combine the data from this Pupil Labs mobile eye tracker to a motion shadow sort of full body IMU-based motion capture suit. We did this little workshop before here where I talked a little bit about those methods. If I have time, I'll try to sort of show some highlights, or one highlight. But long story short, if you're willing to devote some time and effort, you can combine these 2 systems to get this here, which is my laser skeleton that I love so well. So this is the data from the motion capture suit, and the 2 lasers shooting out of his head show the directions that his left and right eyes are pointing as he walks over this terrain. Right out of the way here. And the red and blue dots show the locations of upcoming footholds. And as you can see, as the person is walking, sort of laying down these sort of like epistemic lily pads, where he's sort of finding areas in the terrain that he's sort of going to choose to gain some information in order to be able to walk across this sort of unencountered environment successfully and not falling over, breaking his leg, or anything like that. So the question then is, what is the relationship between this pattern of gaze behavior on the ground and the steps that come up after it, right? So you can see sort of you're looking sort of off in the distance, and some seconds later, you're acting on the basis of the information that you gained. So what can we say about that relationship? So there's going to be sort of, I don't actually have a clock, but there's going to be sort of 3 parts of this. I'm kind of going to breeze through them in the hopes of having time for discussion. And I'm going to start by looking at just that relationship between where you look and where you stepped. So I'm going to come up fast. This is already published, so you can read about it later if you want. So what we did is we took people out and we just had them walk across sort of different types of terrain, roughly organized by difficulty. So what I was showing before is the rough terrain. We also have medium terrain, which is kind of a misnomer, but it's easier than the rougher terrain. And then also this sort of flat ground environment. And the question is, how does the relationship between gaze and foot placement change as the function of the difficulty of the terrain that you're traversing? So to look at that, we sort of realigned gaze from the sort of world-centered reference frame to sort of aligned with the sort of location of the foot. And if you do that for the different terrains, you sort of get this, gaze sort of shows up as this, the probability map of it shows up as sort of this blob that's sort of, 2 to 4 steps ahead of you. So again, not going into too much detail, if you then sort of correlate gaze with upcoming footholds in the different environments, you can see that in the medium and rough terrain, the person's gaze is most highly correlated with the location of that second upcoming step, which means that as they're walking over that environment, people are sort of spending most of their time looking around the area where they're going to be putting their foot 2 steps from now. Whereas in the flat terrain, people sort of do look at the ground, but they're not really fixating their footholds in the same way. And if you actually dive a little deeper, you can see that there's some different strategies that emerge. So purple is the rough, orange is the medium, and in the rough terrain, people are basically splitting their time between steps 2 and 3, possibly sort of in a way to sort of help themselves steer themselves through that sort of difficult terrain. So again, not going into too much detail, you can read about it if you want, but the long story short is that you see these sort of 3 distinctive gaze strategies emerging in these 3 different terrains. However, although there are these sort of distinct things happening, there's one way in which all these behaviors are sort of nicely related, which is, so if you look at how far ahead people look, you can see that green trace, the flat terrain, people looking a little farther ahead, they're moving faster, that's not too surprising. But if instead of asking how far ahead people are looking in space, you ask how long will it be until they get to the place that they're looking, in that domain, everything lines up right on top of itself. So in all the different terrains, people are always looking around where they're going to be around 1.5 to 2 seconds in the future. So just to sum up, what you see here is that you see sort of these 3 distinctive gaze strategies emerging in each of the different terrains we looked at, and yet we see this sort of consistent look-ahead window in time for all the terrains. So what that seems to imply is that walkers are sort of adjusting their gaze behavior to the specific needs of the terrain they're walking over in order to maintain a consistent strategy, which basically boils down to always be sure you know what's going to happen over the next 1.5 seconds. And there's some sort of nice relationship there with what we know about things like visual memory. But that's sort of the long and short of this part of the project, where we sort of looked at just that relationship between where you point your eyes and then what do you do with your feet. And that's all well and good, but that doesn't actually tell us much about the actual visual information that people are using to support that behavior. So this next part, we're going to start trying to dive more deeply into the actual visual information that's supporting this kind of behavior. Specifically, I'm going to look at this idea of optic flow. So optic flow has been studied in the vision science community for 60 some odd years. And it's this idea that the world is mostly stationary and yet we mostly are not. So as I move around, I get these sort of patterns of motion on my retina that are informative about my movement through the world. There's a lot of research on that I'm mostly not going to talk about. But there's a lot, but basically we know a lot about how the brain sort of processes this sort of optic flow visual motion and how we might use that to control our movement through the world. So I've been showing this video as sort of this is what I've been using for that previous part of the research. But I should point out that the actual videos that were coming out of that era of research look like that. That's also the one that you saw on Reddit, if you're into that kind of thing. And although it was nice, the video quality was not as good. In the eye tracker, there was this one eye tracker, it was 30 hertz. With the new eye tracker, it's a 1080p video and 2 120 hertz eye trackers. So in that sort of hardware upgrade was what was really necessary to be able to start, actually diving into the visual information. So just sort of a nice little case of you get better toys and you can ask sort of deeper questions. And so with this sort of higher quality video, we can start running some sort of computational video analysis of the actual head-mounted camera videos and get some, try to get some sort of quantified measurement of what the actual visual information was here. So we run these videos through this optic flow estimation algorithm, which gives you sort of this estimate of visual motion per pixel. And then to sort of track the global structure of that, you can basically take each frame of the video, invert the flow field so that sort of repeller becomes an attractor, send this bunch of particles to drift across that field, and then you can get this sort of map that shows sort of some of the structure of those flow fields. And if you apply that to each frame of the recording, you can get these sort of images that look like this. So just a quick sort of historical note, according to the vision science literature, this should be a nice stable flow field. It is not. That's okay. But this, on the other hand, is the sort of retinally aligned video where we sort of stabilize the image to the point of fixation. And in that retinal frame, you can see the sort of nice, sort of stable flow fields emerging that have this really interesting structure where everything is, because you're fixating a point, you're nulling motion at the fovea, and you get these sort of expansive flow fields that occasionally have these sort of interesting spiral patterns. So now we're going to try to look at sort of diving. So now that we sort of see this sort of structure emerging, let's try to dive into that retinal flow and try to understand sort of what are some features of that retinal structure, or the structure of that retinal flow that might be useful for controlling locomotion. So to get into that, we sort of start by making these sort of very simple eyeball models. So this is a circular eyeball that's moving from left to right and maintaining fixation at this point on the ground. And then as it's moving, you can sort of keep track of the blue dots in the upper visual field and the red dots in the lower visual field, and see how those dots move as you're sort of moving from point A to point B, maintaining fixation on a point in the world. Yeah, don't worry about that. Oh, you can worry about it. It's basically what this shows is sort of from cyan to magenta is sort of early versus late in that movement. Red to blue is sort of upper versus lower visual field. It's kind of complicated, but just what you want to see is that there is sort of some nice smooth-ish structure that's associated with that kind of movement, and perhaps we can exploit that kind of structure to gain information that's necessary that's helpful for the control of locomotion. So here's one example of something that might be useful. So this is now a spherical eyeball fixating a point here, moving along this white arrow. Guess we're not real. And one thing you can note is that when you are moving forward, fixating a point that is on your path, you get zero rotation at the fovea. However, if you are fixating a point that is to the left of your path, you get global rotation in one direction. If you're fixating a point to the right, you get global visual rotation in the other direction. So if you had some way of detecting curl at the fovea, you can know directly from retinal motion whether the point that you're fixating is on or off of your path. And you could use that, so if you sort of fixate a point and you're moving towards it and you see rotation in one direction, you can basically steer your body until you get zero rotation at the fovea, and use that to sort of help you orient yourself as you're walking through the world. So then if you take that same sort of spherical eyeball model and attach it to that laser skeleton that we saw before, you can sort of take the flow field, color map it, put a curl operator on that, color map it so that blue is positive and red is negative. That's rotation counterclockwise, counterclockwise. You can see that retinal curl sort of changes from negative to positive as the head's velocity vector sweeps to the left and right of the point that you're fixating on the ground. And what's more, if you also take those retinal flow fields, and instead of doing curl, apply a divergence operator, you can see that the retinal divergence has this kind of hill-shaped structure where there's a point of maximum divergence shown as that white dot. And as it happens, if you look at that sort of green sort of, the peak of that hill in the divergence map always corresponds to the eye's velocity projected onto the ground. And so what that means is that directly from retinal optic flow, it is possible to infer your head's velocity vector in retinotopic coordinates. And that's very important for the vision science people because your visual cortex is all covered in these sort of retinotopic maps. So this sort of would provide a really nice link between the visual information that you get just by moving through the world and fixating on the ground and the kind of information you need to plan your steps out. because this velocity vector is the same thing, if you don't change mass, as your momentum vector, which is exactly the information that you would need to plan your steps out as you're walking over this type of environment. So that's about that, and that's kind of that's roughly where I've gotten with this. But what's nice about this, and sort of what I'm hoping for the future, is that we can use these kinds of data to sort of ask questions about this kind of behavior from a bunch of different directions. So a couple days ago we did this workshop where we had people playing this, wearing all this gear and walking around, and this is just a person walking while fixating in sort of adequately spaced dots, so just really show it works. And what's special about this is that this was data that we sort of recorded and processed and then laser skeletoned up all within the same day, which if you knew what this process was like to get here, the ability to do this with a group of other people and be confident you can actually get something is a very exciting thing. So my hope is that we sort of collectively can sort of attack these kinds of questions, and sort of attack these sort of data. We can all kind of try to ask our own specific questions from it to sort of understand the kinds of behaviors that we see as we sort of walk through natural environments. And with that, I'll say thank you and open up for questions. And I do specifically want to thank Kate Bonin and Carl Mueller, who were very helpful throughout the past several days. Kate has a talk on Tuesday, where she'll talk about the fact that we have two eyes and why that's neat. And Carl has a poster on some day. I'm not sure which day. Wednesday.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Alex Badri. My question is actually concerning your last comment. You're saying the velocity vector is the same as the momentum vector. Can you explain that in detail?
Well, this is sort of let's see. So first of all, this is one of those things that was not at all a prediction. This is just something that kind of pops out from this data that you can say, oh, that seems like it would be useful. So like the fact that you're fixating a point and moving towards it has this structure associated with it, and that structure seems to be associated with the projection of the eye's velocity. It's something that I wasn't predicting, it just sort of happens. One of the things about this, visual control of foot placement is that foot placement is this inherently physical thing, and vision is sort of not. Well, I mean, it's physical. It's not mechanical, I guess. And basically, because those flow fields are caused by your eye's velocity vector, and velocity and momentum is just mass times velocity. It means that these flow fields are informative about your body's momentum along the ground plane.
Okay, so if you change body mass or body height more.
Say it again?
So if you're changing body mass, body height, so if you're changing subjects, you would change into it.
Right.
Using children, you would see very different numbers on this 1.5 seconds eventually?
Yes, but no. So that stuff winds up being for the individual subject. But I'm talking specifically about for this particular human trying to plan these particular steps. That velocity vector tells this person their momentum vector at that time. So if you believe in things like inverted pendulum models of movement, this is the information that you would need to be able to choose, I'm going to put my foot here versus there, because the selection of a good foothold needs to have some sense of your current mechanical state in it. So as this video is playing, what this would show is that you can get that information about your movement directly from visual information without having to do some sort of complicated, a lot of the neuroscience would have assumed that you have to sort of have some model of yourself, and you can sort of infer from build some model of the world, and then yada, yada, yada. What this says is that information about your momentum is sort of baked directly into the patterns of motion that are hitting the back of your retina. That helps.
Hi. Oh, yeah, all right, that works. So I was interested, you mentioned that you kind of like 2 or 3 steps or like 1.5 seconds or something, where it seems like you might be like path planning, right? Did you see any interesting things in your data, maybe when somebody would slip and how that might have changed that 1.5 second time or the response there?
So there is a slip in one of those videos, but I don't think I can really sniper that. It's one of those things that I really want to look at, but sort of at this stage in the process, I haven't yet. Because you do see people occasionally kind of slip and they kind of, they do something. And it would be a really interesting question to ask, sort of how those sort of, longer term plans change when something goes wrong. But one of the things you'll notice about that era of research is I took all the data, sort of poured it into a pot and then look at the statistics. So because you get thousands of steps, but like maybe a dozen slips, it's harder to do that. But I think as this space becomes a little more defined, you sort of have enough sort of background to start asking, okay, how does this break down when someone actually slips? And so I don't really know. The data does live in the data set that I have, but I haven't specifically looked at it. But I think that's exactly the kind of question you would want to ask moving forward. Sort of a cheater answer, but that's what I got.
Okay, hi. Thank you for a fascinating talk. So my question is more direct related to application of this. So the knowledge you learned, can you share what's your thoughts for apply this knowledge?
Yeah. So so far, I pretty much study young healthy people who walking over these kind of environments, and I think that one of the things that I don't think anyone here would deny is that when you think about applications for things like elderly people or stuff like that, we locomote in environments that require vision to be a part of that process, and I think that relationship between visual information and locomotor control is something that's relatively understudied. And so understanding the human locomotor system sort of as a whole, including sensory information and eye movements and the sort of the motor mechanical aspects, is something that we're really going to need to understand what happens when the system starts to break down as a result of aging or disease or injury or something like that. And I think that building better treatments or assessments for locomotor disorders is going to require us to understand that relationship. And so my hope is that by sort of building this sort of like global perception action cycle, a better sense of this global perception action cycle, it'll help us better understand things that affect our ability to move through the world sort of in a more global sense. I have thought about that, and I think a lot of other people around here have thought about that as well. What about bipedal robots? And I think that gets back to the start of sort of this idea of like, the meat robots versus the regular robots, where humans are really good at moving through the world. And so I think the hope is that you might be able to, by looking at what the human does, and particularly like sort of where you point your fovea, that gives you a sense of how our central nervous system solves the problem of moving through these sort of complicated natural environments. And so we might be able to see some strategies that make sense and then apply them to the sort of controls that we put on our robots.
So you've got some interesting correlations to terrain complexity. If you're inside of one terrain type and you reduced visual information, like started to turn the lights out, do you have any theory on what happens to this data with less visual information?
So Kate's talk is actually looking at if you take away like your binocular information, how does that affect your behavior? And there's getting some interesting stuff there. But I think about sort of locomotion, particularly over rocky terrain, as sort of having this sort of perceptual bottleneck to it, where the thing that's probably slowing us down is our ability to get the information in quick enough. I mean, I think there's nothing about taking these kinds of steps that requires you to slow down, but people do slow down because I think you have to get the information at a quick enough rate. And so I think that if you were to sort of tighten that bottleneck more, either by turning off the lights or if you're doing some your binocular thing, it's gonna force you into a regime where you have to make bigger sacrifices to what you would prefer to do on flat terrain because you don't have the ability to get the information fast enough.
Yeah, what about the scenario where you ran like a machine vision algorithm and did some pre-filtering on features, so you had good features but you had less of them? Would that go the opposite direction in terms of your ability?
Yeah, I mean, that would be hard, but one could imagine how one would do it using some AR or something like that. So I mean, that would be a beautiful vision for the future, where if we got this, so if using this kind of data to infer, okay, this is what a good foothold is, this is what a good, this is what a good, you could put your foot here, because of where you're moving, this is where you should put your foot. Perhaps you could sort of tag those locations and then have, super rock walkers wearing AR headsets. Yeah, sure. All right, let's do that.
Quick question, quick answers.
Okay.
One, your 1.5 second look ahead reminds me of the magic number 7 plus or minus 2.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering, is there any, have people done studies on working memory for vision?
So they have, usually in the context of reaching.
And maybe repeat my question.
So Art is asking about why 1.5 seconds seems to be an interesting number for this task. And they have done, like for reaching studies, it seems like 2 seconds is we seem to have a really hard time holding specific visual information in our head for longer than about 2 seconds. Why that number is anyone's, well, I mean, it's complicated, but it does seem like that's about as long as we can hold information in our head to the specificity necessary to actually plan an action out.